You'll spend your whole life renting. That was the sentence people would remember later, the one that made the table go quiet, the one my daughter-in-law said with a smile, because she thought it was safe. But that came later, before that sentence. There was a dinner I was expected to attend. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created by the Her Chains channel team, based on real-life situations to convey lessons about family, emotions, and human values. All characters and events are illustrative. My name is Margaret Ellison. I arrived at my son's house just after sunset, carrying a dish no one had asked for. My daughter-in-law, Natalie, had planned the evening down to the last detail, the seating, the timing, the way conversation flowed toward promotions, renovations, and plans that assumed permanence. I stepped into it the way I always did, careful not to interrupt, careful not to take up space that wasn't offered. I was there because my son had invited me, "Mom, you should come," then left the details to Natalie. Natalie greeted me warmly enough, the way you do when manners are part of your image. She took the dish from my hands and set it aside without asking what it was. Then she guided me to the far end of the table, away from the center where she and my son sat. It wasn't unkind. It was efficient. Dinner moved quickly. People talked over me without noticing. Someone asked if I was still in the same place. Another commented on how hard it must be to keep moving. Never really settling. I smiled and nodded. Renting had become the shorthand for who they thought I was. Temporary, unfinished, slightly behind. Natalie laughed lightly at one point and said something about how owning changed everything, how stability mattered. Her eyes flicked toward me for half a second, just long enough to include me in the comparison. My son kept eating. He didn't look up. I had learned, over time, that correcting people invited complications I no longer wanted. Silence was simpler. Silence let the evening move on. Still, as the plates were cleared and the wine kept coming, I felt the familiar narrowing in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just the quiet awareness that everyone at that table believed they understood my life completely, and that belief had settled in long before I sat down. Natalie didn't raise her voice to control the room. She never had to. She guided it the way someone does when they're used to being agreed with. "Let's start before everything gets cold," she said, tapping her glass lightly. Not a request. A cue. Plates moved. Chairs shifted. Conversations reset around her timing. I reached for the bread basket, then stopped when Natalie slid it back toward the center without looking at me. Someone else filled the space with a story about refinancing. Natalie nodded along, adding details, finishing sentences. She was good at that, making people feel like they were building something together. "So, Margaret," she said at last, smiling as if she'd just noticed me, "you're still renting, right?" The word landed easily, like something already agreed upon. "Yes," I said. I kept my voice even. "I am," she nodded, satisfied. "I don't know how you do it. I'd hate not knowing where I'll be in 5 years." My son glanced up then. Just briefly. He said it the way he said everything around Natalie, like agreement was the quickest way out. Natalie laughed. That's one word for it. The conversation moved on without me. Someone asked about the neighborhood schools. Natalie answered. Someone mentioned property taxes. Natalie answered. I listened to my life being summarized by omission. I'd seen this shape before, years ago, at birthdays, holidays, casual lunches. Each time I didn't correct a small assumption, it hardened. Renting became shorthand. Quiet became consent. Once. Long ago. I'd tried to explain. I'd mentioned a promotion, an investment. Natalie had smiled too quickly and said, "That must be nice." The way people do when they're already calculating what it means for them. After that came the calls, the suggestions, the expectations. I learned. Do you want more wine? Natalie asked now, already pouring before I answered. No, thank you, I said. She paused, surprised, then handed the bottle to someone else. My son didn't look at me again. He focused on his plate, on keeping things smooth. He always had. By the time dessert arrived, my presence had settled into something comfortable for them, predictable, harmless, easy to overlook, and I stayed exactly where they had learned to place me. Natalie waited until the plates were cleared and the room had settled into that loose, comfortable noise people make when they think the evening has already gone well. She lifted her glass and smiled. I swear, she said, laughing softly, owning this place still doesn't feel real sometimes. Someone agreed. Someone else mentioned how fast the market had moved. Natalie nodded, soaking it in. Then she turned toward me. Well, she said, still smiling, not everyone needs to rush into ownership, I guess. She tilted her head, almost kind. Some people are fine renting. Right, Margaret. The pause that followed was brief, but deliberate. Before I could answer, she added, louder now. I mean, you'll probably spend your whole life renting. And that's okay. The table laughed. Natalie had her parents there and two couples from their church people who repeated stories like they were facts. Not cruel laughter, comfortable laughter. The kind that assumes permission. I felt the heat rise in my chest, then settle. I placed my fork down carefully, making sure it didn't clink against the plate. My hands stayed steady. I didn't look up. Across from me, my son shifted in his chair. Nat, he said quietly, not quite a warning, more a reflex. She waved him off. What I didn't mean it badly. She looked back at me. It's just different priorities, right? I nodded once. Different priorities. I said. That seemed to satisfy her. She turned back to the others, already moving on. Someone joked about mortgage rates. Someone else mentioned equity. Natalie joined in easily, explaining how they'd timed everything just right. How lucky they'd been. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believes the ground beneath her is solid. My son stared at his plate. He didn't defend me. He didn't laugh either. He focused on cutting his food into smaller pieces, as if precision might smooth the moment over. I'd heard variations of that joke before. Comments about flexibility, about not being tied down, about how brave it must be to live without roots. This time, though, something shifted. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily they were said, how certain Natalie sounded, how sure everyone else was that this version of me was settled fact. I stayed quiet. I always had, but the weight of that sentence lingered, pressing into the space between us. Long after the laughter faded, I didn't correct them because I'd tried once before, years ago, at a smaller table with fewer witnesses. I'd said, I'm doing fine. I meant it honestly. I mentioned a promotion, an investment that had worked. I thought clarity would settle things. Natalie's smile had tightened. That's good to know, she'd said, already calculating. We've been talking about upgrading. Maybe you could weigh in. My son had added. Mom's always been good with numbers. After that came the expectations. Suggestions disguised as jokes. Calls that started friendly and ended with pauses where money might fit. I learned how quickly truth turns into leverage. So I stopped offering it. At this dinner, when Natalie said, some people are fine renting, I heard all of that history in one word. Renting meant I was neutral. Renting meant I wasn't a resource. Renting kept my life from becoming a discussion. My son leaned toward me then and murmured, You okay? I'm fine, I said. And I was. In the way I'd taught myself to be, silence had worked for a long time. It kept requests away. It kept peace intact. It let me love my son without negotiating terms. But sitting there, listening to my life reduced to a punchline, I felt the edge of that silence dull, not broken, just worn thin. Renting had been a boundary, not a weakness, and that boundary had just been stepped on. The more I built, the quieter I became. Wealth doesn't just attract respect, it attracts entitlement. No one at that table knew what I'd done before I became someone's mother. They didn't know I'd spent 3 decades working as an operations analyst. The kind of job where mistakes show up months later and success looks like nothing happened at all. I learned early how to plan for what people forgot to consider: cash flow, risk, time. "I don't know how you've managed on your own all these years," Natalie said once, a few summers back. She'd meant it as a compliment or a warning. I never asked which. "I manage," I'd replied. That was the truth. I took raises instead of titles. I invested when it made sense and walked away when it didn't. I paid things off slowly, deliberately. No sudden windfalls. No dramatic leaps. Just consistency. When I downsized after my husband died, my son had said, "You don't have to live so small, I want to." I told him. That part was also true. Modesty gave me room to think. It kept my life quiet. Natalie once joked, "You live like someone who doesn't care about nice things." I smiled. "I care about the right ones." She'd laughed, assuming it was a deflection. They didn't ask where my weekends went, or why I sometimes drove by the water on my way home. They didn't ask why I knew the market so well, or why I never reacted when conversations turned to property values. I listened. I noted. I said very little. There was a place near the water I'd looked at more than once. Not for show. Not for anyone else. It fit my numbers. It fit my timeline. I kept that to myself. At the dinner table, Natalie talked about square footage and appreciation like ownership was a personality trait. People nodded. My son listened. Proud and relieved, I sat there, hands folded, aware of how invisible a careful life can become when no one bothers to ask what you're building, and how easily that invisibility can be mistaken for emptiness. Natalie leaned back in her chair, satisfied in the way people are when they know a story will land well. "I still can't believe we pulled it off," she said. "A place like that. Right now, everyone told us to wait. It's a great house," someone said. "You got in at the perfect time." Natalie smiled wider. "We really did." She talked about the layout, the light, the way the neighborhood felt established. Not bragging, exactly. More like narrating proof. Each detail reinforced the same message they had arrived. My son nodded along. "It's been good for us," he said. "Feels permanent." Permanent. That word stayed with me. Natalie turned to me again. "You should come by sometime, Margaret. See what ownership looks like when you stop renting." There it was. Casual. Confident. "I've seen it," I said. She blinked. "You have?" "Yes," she laughed, assuming I meant something else. "Well, this is different." We went through a proper management company. Everything was handled professionally. I kept my eyes on her. I know. The truth was simple, even if it sounded complicated when explained. Natalie talked about it like they'd bought it. She never used the word rent when there were people to impress. It was held by a limited liability company, which sat beneath a family trust I'd established years earlier. My name didn't appear anywhere they'd think to look. An independent property manager handled everything. Leases, maintenance, payments. Natalie had signed papers with a company, not a person. She'd never asked who stood behind it. Most tenants didn't. You really can't imagine how stressful buying is. Natalie continued. "The paperwork alone. I imagine it just fine," I said. My son finally looked at me then, puzzled. "What do you mean?" I smiled lightly. "Nothing. I had approved their lease myself. Reviewed their application the way I reviewed all of them. quietly, methodically, without emotion. At the time, it felt clean, separate. Family on one side, business on the other. At the table, Natalie kept talking, unaware of how carefully the ground beneath her had been laid. I listened, aware of how many assumptions can stand upright when no one challenges them, and how close those assumptions were to collapsing under their own weight. Natalie's smile lingered longer than it needed to. "You know," she said, setting her glass down, "there's something freeing about owning. Not worrying about leases. Not wondering when you'll have to move again." She glanced at me, then back to the others, as if the thought had just occurred to her. It changes how people see you. No one laughed this time. They didn't need to. The message had already settled. My son shifted beside her. "Nat," he said, low and careful. What she replied, "I'm just saying, stability matters." I felt something tighten, then loosen. The joke had crossed a line without raising its voice. It wasn't about renting anymore. It was about who I was allowed to be in this family. I leaned back in my chair. My hands were calm. That surprised me. My son turned to me. "Mom, I'm listening," I said. Natalie's tone softened, almost generous. "I didn't mean anything by it. I just think everyone wants more, eventually." I nodded. "They do. For years. My silence had protected all of us. It kept my son from choosing sides. It kept Natalie comfortable. It kept expectations low and boundaries unspoken. But silence also has a cost. Tonight, it was being used to define me in front of people who would carry that version forward. I opened the property manager portal and kept it on the screen quietly, like a document you hope you won't have to use. Not to interrupt. Just to be ready, whatever came next. I knew I wouldn't be quiet about it. Natalie reached for the dessert plates, already turning the conversation towards something lighter. "I'll grab these," she said. No reason to let things get awkward. I spoke before she could stand. "The house you live in," I said, calmly, "belongs to me." The table stilled, not all at once. One fork stopped. A glass paused midair. Natalie laughed once, short and automatic. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking," I said. My son turned toward me. "Mom?" I held his gaze. "It's held through a trust." I continued. "The trust owns a limited liability company. That company owns the property." Natalie's smile didn't fade yet. It hovered, waiting for someone else to step in. "That can't be right," she said. "We signed with a management firm." "Yes," I said. "An independent one." I unlocked my phone and placed it on the table, turning the screen so they could see. The header showed the company name. Beneath it, the property address. Beneath that, the approval log. Natalie leaned forward despite herself. "This says approved by..." She stopped. Her voice caught. "That's your name." I nodded. I reviewed the application. I approved the lease. My son stared at the screen. His mouth opened, then closed again. He didn't look at Natalie. He didn't look at anyone. "That's not possible," Natalie said. Quieter now. "We would have known. You signed what was presented," I said. "Most people don't ask who's behind a trust." Her hands moved to the edge of the table. She gripped it. Hard. "You let us think," she began. "I let you speak," I said. "The way you always have." The room had gone completely silent. No one laughed. No one filled the space. Even the people who had been eager moments earlier now avoided eye contact. My son finally spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice barely there. "Why didn't you tell me I didn't hide it?" I said. "I just didn't offer it." Natalie's face had lost its color. She sat back slowly, as if the chair might give way beneath her. I left the phone where it was and folded my hands in my lap. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't stood up. I'd only said one sentence. and everything they thought they knew had shifted. No one stopped me when I stood. Natalie looked like she might say something, then didn't. My son watched me with an expression I hadn't seen before, caught between confusion and something close to fear. "I should go," I said. "That's it?" Natalie asked. Her voice was thin now. "You're just leaving?" "Yes," I said. "That's enough for tonight." My son rose halfway from his chair. "Mom, wait." I touched his shoulder briefly. "We'll talk later." I walked out without another word. No slammed doors, no raised voices. I didn't need any of that. The next morning, I called Dahlia, the property manager. She answered on the second ring. "Send the notice," I said. She didn't ask why. She never did. That was the point of doing things properly. The notice went out that afternoon. Clear language, clear timeline, 30 days to cure the balance or vacate. Business, not punishment. My son called that evening. "You're really doing this?" He said. "I am." I replied, "You could have warned us." "I did." I said, "For years, just not in the way you wanted." Natalie didn't call. She sent a message instead. It was long, defensive, careful not to apologize. I didn't respond. Weeks passed. Paperwork moved forward. Boundaries held. At family gatherings after that, things were different. Quieter. Politer. People chose their words more carefully around me. Natalie avoided my eyes. My son tried. Once. To joke things back to normal. It didn't land. I hadn't asked for distance. I hadn't demanded respect. I'd simply stopped absorbing what was never mine to carry. And that changed everything without another argument being said. My phone rang once I'd set my keys down. "Mom?" my son said. His voice was careful now. "I didn't know." "I know." I said. "I should have stopped it." "Yes." I said again. "Not unkind, just true." He exhaled. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't," I said. "You learn from it." We sat in that silence for a moment. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clear. Later, Natalie sent a short message. No jokes, no edges. I didn't realize. I read it. I didn't reply. What I kept that night wasn't the house or the paperwork or the proof. It was the knowledge that I could speak plainly and still remain myself. For years, silence had been my armor. It protected everyone else. It cost me more than I admitted. Here's the lesson I took with me, the one I'd share with anyone listening. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're instructions. If you don't state them, others will decide where you end and they begin. When I stopped absorbing what wasn't mine, the room changed. So did the relationships. Not dramatically, permanently. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, or subscribe. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them. Before I went to bed, my son texted again. "I should have defended you. I didn't. I'm sorry. I'm proud of you for not shrinking." I smiled at the screen and set the phone face down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to.